What if the deadliest weapon wasn't forged in fire but woven in silence? What if death arrived not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, delicate work of a seam? In the steamy heart of 1853 Tennessee, a prominent family began to fade away, one by one. Their perfectly tailored clothes, the very fabric of their lives, held a secret so sinister, so subtle, that no one dared to speak its name. This is the story of Louisa, an enslaved woman whose hands were her voice and whose needle became an instrument of justice. The forgotten truth of her vengeance is a chilling tale we explore on The Forgotten Cell. The midsummer air hung thick and humid, clinging to the thin dresses that swayed on the clothesline like patient ghosts. In the distance, the grand, white-pillared plantation house presided over the land with an air of cold, unblinking indifference. Inside, the family went about their daily rituals, the mistress with her delicate teacup, the master with his hat pulled low. They were surrounded by shadows they could not see, a poison they could not name, and a fate they could not escape. In the workroom behind the house, rows of wooden benches held the enslaved women. Their hands were a blur of motion, their fingers twisting threads and guiding needles with weary, practiced grace. Amid them was Louisa, her posture slender and poised. Her fingers moved with a silent, mechanical precision, weaving fine stitches through linen and silk. While her face was a portrait of passive obedience, her dark eyes were deep pools of unyielding resolve. They held the weight of a lifetime of memory, sorrow, and simmering determination. Louisa's work was deeply personal, intimate. She hemmed the mistress's elegant gowns, mended the master's vests, and embroidered the tiny christening gowns for newborn children. Each garment, each stitch was set with meticulous care, the family completely oblivious to the deadly calculus hidden within the very fibers of their clothes. It began almost unnoticeably. A faint red rash on the mistress's wrist that she dismissed as an insect bite. The children soon began to complain of chills and lingering aches that no amount of rest could cure. The master's mind grew foggy and irritable, a dull confusion clouding his gaze. A family physician was called, a punctual man who recorded their symptoms with a serious, careful hand: nausea, dizziness, skin inflammation, and a slow-spreading tremor. He blamed the usual culprits of the era, a summer fever, the oppressive humidity, or perhaps tainted well water. Suspicion never once fell on Louisa. Her hands continued their work and her lips remained sealed. Around day 20, the first death came. The youngest daughter, a pale little doll, was found still and silent in her bed. No tears announced her passing, just a profound hush that fell over the house. Then came the matriarch, her breath slowing, her hair falling in thin wisps, her skin blistering and raw. The doctor's certainty wavered. His theory shifted from fever to poison, and he immediately ordered all their clothes sealed away for inspection. He discovered strange oily residues and subtle discoloration, but the crude chemical analysis of the time was inconclusive. There were no forensic labs, only intuition wrestling with growing whispers. The mistress, caught in a fevered delirium, whispered of a fire burning beneath her skin. The master's appetite vanished as his eyes nervously scanned the faces of his servants. Louisa sat at her bench, a statue of stillness. To an outsider, she was simply a woman at her work, but a new, terrifying rumor began to slither through the household. Talk of linens that burned the skin, a faint odor of bitter almonds, and hushed warnings to avoid the new satin blouse. The seamstress's quarters were a separate world, a place of quiet, forgotten labor, and no chain of evidence led back to her. She was a silent, unmoving force, existing in the space between visibility and invisibility. Her work was her voice. Her silence was her power. Once the children lay in their quiet coffins and the widow's mourning filled the halls, whispers began to emerge. Did the seamstress slip something in the thread? Was the poison infused through some hidden stitching or from the subtle pressing of crushed plants into the fabric? No one had seen her preparing anything out of the ordinary, yet every victim wore her patchwork, her monograms, and her lace. The rumors gained strength, tales of a secret herbal lore, of resistance passed down in hushed sermons, of plants that could kill when pressed into cloth. Nobody from outside the quarters could confirm it. Louisa did not speak. She was described as quiet, efficient, and obedient, and her name was not written in any ledger. Yet every frayed seam, every mend, bound the suspicion tighter. The house had become a cage of their own making, filled with a silence far more terrifying than any scream. It stood still, but it was not peaceful. The air inside grew heavy, layered with unspoken fear and sickness. The servants moved like ghosts, careful not to disturb the dread that had taken root. The White family, once so vibrant and commanding, retreated into the shadows of their own home. The grand halls, once filled with the sounds of their forced laughter and polite conversation, now echoed with shuffling footsteps and sickly coughs. Behind their closed doors, linen sheets were soaked with sweat, and strange, venomous-looking lesions erupted on the skin of those who wore the exquisite garments sewn by Louisa. But this was not a story of a family's decline. It was the unfolding of a long-simmering vengeance. The true tale began many years before, a patchwork of wounds and whispered injustices that Louisa carried with her every step of the way. Louisa was born into bondage in North Carolina and sold south at the tender age of 14. The ledger of her previous owner simply noted the sale was precipitated by a disciplinary incident, a cold and sterile phrase for a horrific event. Unconfirmed rumors followed her, whispers that a young boy who had wronged her had met a sudden agonizing end in the fields, his cries silenced before anyone could understand. When she arrived in Tennessee, she was a study in quiet composure. Her immediate, almost supernatural skill with a needle and thread was recognized, sparing her from the brutal labor of the fields and earning her a place in the seamstress quarters under the direct supervision of the house mistress. What no one knew, what no one cared to know, was that Louisa carried far more than her needle. In her first years on the new plantation, she forged a quiet, powerful bond with an older enslaved woman named Bet. Bet was a midwife, her eyes clouded by cataracts, but her mind was a library of old knowledge. She remembered the names of plants that could make a man bleed from the inside out. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from age, as she passed on the ancient lore of roots and saps that delivered death in a slow, insidious trickle. Bet had watched her own children sold away, and in Louisa, she saw a vessel for a justice she could never enact. Under the guise of gathering herbs for dyes, Louisa learned to find the sources of these subtle poisons. The White family never questioned her trips. A seamstress's work was too domestic, too mundane to raise suspicion. She collected guyseweed seeds, dried belladonna berries, and scraped the lethal resin from wild hemlock. Each ingredient had its own language of death. Alone, they were dangerous, but when combined in precise quantities and infused into fabric linings, they became a silent, potent whisper of vengeance. With each garment she repaired, a quiet decision was made. A single hidden thread, a subtle fold, a lining made slightly heavier to hold its deadly secret. She worked with the unhurried patience of a woman who knew that time was on her side. Death didn't need to be sudden. In fact, it was better if it came slowly, like a disease that couldn't be named. By midsummer, a chilling pattern began to emerge. Servants who handled the family's clothes too often started to show signs of illness. A maid collapsed after wearing a hand-me-down shawl. A stable boy developed ulcers after carrying a load of freshly laundered coats. The plantation doctor, desperate for an answer, suspected environmental toxins, but nothing made sense. The symptoms were too erratic. The White family dismissed his fears as superstition. Within the enslaved quarters, the whispers were of a different kind. They spoke of Louisa's hands as blessed or cursed. Some feared her, keeping a wide berth, while others left small offerings at the threshold of her room, thread, beads, and roots. They were not gifts, but acknowledgments of a power they understood. They knew, or at least they guessed, but no one spoke of it openly. The White family's decline became a spectacle of dread. Their youngest son, once so robust, began to waste away. The master of the house descended into maddening hallucinations, screaming at shadows and accusing his own children of betrayal. The mistress was confined to her bed, her eyes glazed, her breath a ragged struggle for air. Rumors of witchcraft spread beyond the plantation gates, but a traveling preacher found nothing but sorrow and decay. And through it all, Louisa remained calm, her fingers never stopping, the silent weaver of their doom. A single night changed everything. The plantation cook, her face pale with terror, claimed she saw Louisa speaking to someone who wasn't there, a shadow standing beneath the trees, perhaps the ghost of Bet, her old mentor. When the master questioned her, Louisa simply lowered her eyes and resumed her work, her silence as impenetrable as ever. The grand plantation, once a symbol of wealth and power, now smelled of slow decay, and at its heart, Louisa stitched on, each movement a quiet act of defiance, each hemline a veil drawn between vengeance and the truth. By late August, the house was a tomb. The sounds of piano music and idle chatter had long since faded, replaced by the hushed, stifled breath of a home suffocating in its own fear. The family's decline was no longer a mystery. It had become a horrifying certainty. One by one, they succumbed to a sickness no doctor could name and no servant could ignore. The master, once a pillar of control, now wandered the corridors in a daze, his skin yellowed, his eyes sunken and ringed with red. He would mutter names, some living, some long dead, and flinch at the very touch of his own clothes. One day he ripped off his shirt mid-meal, collapsing into a fit of spasms in front of 2 stunned guests from Alabama. They didn't stay the night. His wife, bedridden for weeks, no longer recognized her surroundings. Her skin was a map of small, weeping sores that bled with every movement. The new physician, brought in by the overseer, suggested arsenic poisoning, though he admitted it didn't make sense for it to manifest through the skin. He ordered all fabrics from the sleeping quarters to be removed and initiated fumigations, but nothing changed. The remaining children were confined to their rooms, their bodies racked with aching joints and bleeding gums. The family's eldest son, once the heir to the estate, now refused to leave his bed, babbling about insects crawling under his skin and fire behind his eyes. He tore at his neck until it bled, and when a nursemaid tried to calm him, he struck her. She fled that same night. The staff began to move differently, their eyes avoiding the family, their communication reduced to frightened glances. Among themselves, they knew this was something more than a fever. The laundry room, once bustling with activity, was now nearly deserted. Workers who refused to handle the garments were punished, but many simply fell ill themselves, their hands covered in the same strange, unhealing lesions. Those who touched the clothes too often never seemed to recover, but Louisa, in her quiet corner, remained untouched. She never coughed or ached, and her skin was clear. She stitched steadily on, her movements calm and precise. She nodded to her orders, delivered the finished garments without a word, but her silence had grown to something heavy and unsettling. One of the housemaids, Sarah, confided to another that Louisa had asked for a specific bitter-smelling root from the woods months ago, something not used for dyes. At the time, Sarah thought nothing of it. Now she wondered aloud if it had been part of this quiet horror. Late one evening, the overseer's daughter was found unconscious on the parlor floor, her skin flushed, her breath ragged. She had been wearing a shawl that Louisa had just repaired. The overseer, a hard man known for his cruelty, stormed through Louisa's quarters, tearing everything apart, but he found nothing, only spools of thread, needles, and fabric. Louisa stood silently, her arms at her sides, her expression unreadable. The next morning the overseer demanded she be confined, but the master, barely conscious, murmured a refusal. "She's done nothing," he repeated, his eyes glazed and vacant. The house was a ship without a captain, and its master was too far gone to act. That night a fire broke out in a far-off shed. It was quickly contained, but the fear had already spread. Some believed the land itself was cursed. Others whispered of spirits, of silent rebellion waged not with blades or fire, but with thread and cloth. And through it all, Louisa still stitched, her hands steady, her eyes calm. No one dared to stop her. The plantation had become a place of absences. Its windows shuddered against imagined threats, its once grand halls filled only with shuffling footsteps, the hesitant creak of floorboards, and the persistent, rattling cough of a life slowly wasting away behind a closed door. The house's final act of terror arrived not in a flash of lightning, but in the methodical presence of Dr. Albert Greaves. He was a physician from Charleston, known for tackling illnesses that mystified local doctors. Yet as he moved through the estate, he felt an unnameable unease, a chill that had nothing to do with the humid air. A man of logic, he began his examination meticulously, studying the sick, documenting their bizarre symptoms. But it was the family's clothes that caught his eye. He noticed a faint discoloration on the linings, a subtle stiffness to the thread, and a sharp, bitter odor clinging to the fabric. It was a scent he knew was not of nature, but of poison. Greaves immediately ordered that all clothes prepared by the seamstress be sealed away and that no one wear them. Quietly, he began to question the house staff about the woman in the sewing room. He asked how long she had been there. if anyone had seen her mix anything into her work. No one answered directly. Instead, they would look away, their silence a chorus of knowing fear. The pressure mounted, and whispers turned into outright accusations. The overseer, whose own daughter was still recovering, demanded Louisa be brought forward. She stood in the center of the parlor, her face calm as the oil lamp's flicker danced across it. Surrounded by the trembling, sickened faces of her accusers, they questioned her. Did she handle strange substances? Did she poison the fabrics? Who taught her what she knew? Louisa's answer was a single defiant phrase: none of it. Her gaze was steady, looking past their fear and their sickness. The master, too weak to rise from his bed, sent word that no action should be taken without proof, but proof was a luxury no one had. Greaves tried his own chemical tests on the fabric, but the results were inconclusive. He was certain a plant-based toxin was present, but the exact compound eluded him. The mob, however, didn't need proof. The house staff demanded her punishment, whispering of whippings and other darker things. Execution, a burial alive, salt in the soil to curse the earth she walked on. The plantation was no longer ruled by law, but by a fevered, murderous dread. They called it a trial, but there were no judges, only an overseer, a frustrated doctor, and a gathering of terrified souls. Louisa was locked in a cold storage room beneath the house, where bales of cloth were kept and rats scuttled in the dark. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply waited. The cook, who slipped her food, later reported that Louisa was whispering names, not prayers, names no one recognized, or perhaps names they refused to admit they knew. But then a sudden dramatic turn. A violent storm swept through the region, and a bolt of lightning struck a tree near the house. In the chaos of the storm, the storage room door was found open. Louisa was gone. There was no broken lock, no footprints in the wet soil. Some swore the door had never even been locked. The overseer launched a desperate search, with dogs and marshals brought in from town, but she had vanished into thin air, leaving only a half-finished garment and a needle still embedded in the master's monogram. The family continued to fade one by one. Those who survived never recovered, their bodies and minds shattered. By winter, the once proud plantation was abandoned, a hollow monument to a silent curse. Some claimed Louisa had drowned in the nearby creek. Others said she escaped north, aided by those who knew what she had done. But among the enslaved people who remained in the region, a different story was told. A story of a woman who sowed death not out of hatred, but out of a long-held memory. A woman who vanished not into the woods, but into legend. Over a century later, the plantation stands in ruin, its grand facade swallowed by ivy, its roof caved in. The trees that line the road are gnarled like reaching fingers, and tourists rarely venture so far into the Tennessee woods. Yet every few years someone finds their way there. Historians, ghost hunters, or simply travelers drawn by a force they can't explain. They come for the story of Louisa, though few know her name, calling her the seamstress or the silent one. Some believe she was a witch, others a martyr. The truth has long since unraveled, but strange things remain. In 1962, a man found a small trunk beneath the floorboards of the old sewing room. Inside were scraps of fabric, each labeled with the names of the deceased family members. Several of the pieces were stained with oily smudges. When a worker handled one, he developed a rash that lasted for weeks. The man abandoned the project entirely. In 1985, 2 anthropology students visited the site. One of them, Annalise, wrote in her journal that the ruins felt as if they were waiting for something. She found rusted sewing needles embedded in the floor, and that night, she dreamed of a woman with gleaming eyes, sitting at a broken sewing table. Annalise never returned to the plantation. The local archives contain little to explain the events. A doctor's journal with entries that abruptly end in 1853, a death ledger with more names than graves, and a single letter from the mistress of the house, written in a trembling hand, which ends with the chilling words, "She watches while we sleep. I know it now." Among the black communities nearby, oral traditions persist. Elder women speak of a spirit that punishes cruelty slowly and patiently. They call her by no name, but leave spools of thread on their windowsills just in case. They say a preacher once tried to exorcise the grounds, but fled after 3 days, saying only, "Some wounds never close. Some hands never stop sewing." The local people still believe Louisa was not a fiction, but a terrible, vengeful truth, because they cannot explain the garments. On rare occasions, fragments of the 19th century fabric appear at estate sales and antique shops, beautifully stitched and aged. Collectors who handle them report a sudden unease, a feeling of numbness in their fingertips, or a mysterious illness. No scientific explanation has ever held up, and so the legend endures. The plantation is a place no one dares to disturb, its foundation buckling, its windows dark, and no birds dare to nest in its rafters. But in the sewing room, barely visible beneath a century of dust, is a single word scratched into the stone with a sharp tool. Louis. Was it her name? A final haunting confession? No one knows. But when the wind moves through the house, it sounds like threads slipping through fabric.